Hello everyone. Another night with Open Security Mini Summit. We're in March 2021. We have with us John Melton today. He has been a long-time community member. He understands the summit spirit. He's been through this, and we're very lucky to have him with us today. He's going to be talking about semgrep in SDLC, different stages of SDLC. And if you're interested in semgrep, do check our YouTube channel. We do have other sessions we've done before, and we will probably have others there in the future as well. I think that is me. And John, over to you.
All right, thanks. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about security across the SDLC. It's a little bit kind of my brain dump and how I see the world. So it's a good thing for discussion and arguments and questions and so forth. So certainly hop in whenever. So I'm going to try to, I think the deck is maybe 40 slides, so it's a little bit longer, but I will cruise through some of them pretty quickly. Some of them are more focused on process and ideas, and some are more focused on tools. I'll try to spend more time on tooling, unless people, particularly have thoughts in other places. So, and semgrep's going to factor in kind of significantly in the back half. So we'll get going. I framed it really simply. What have we tried? What do we want to actually do? And then how do we get from A to B? So as an intro, this talk from Clint, at the time, Clint was the research director at NCC, and he had been giving, speaking to a lot of teams that had been doing things, called DevSecOps, but decent security teams. And he'd also kind of surveyed lots of good security talks that were looking at process and tools and really the dynamics of how teams are set up and what they angle for. It was a really great talk. I highly recommend it. Clint now is at R2C, the company that makes semgrep, so I guess salient, but certainly good talk to go to. My talk will not be as good as that one was, so please go watch it. But some similar ideas are going to shake out my particular view of the world. So as my day job, I do director of product security work. That's kind of what I spend my time doing. But relevant to this talk, I do OAuth and open sourcey things. I've kind of lived at that intersection of security and development, meandering back and forth between those for my whole career. And I built a SaaS product in a previous role. And so, I care deeply about SaaS in general. And I like semgrep a lot. I think they've figured out and done some things really well.
Which one was that? If I may ask? What product was that?
Yeah, White Hat. So I went over to White Hat right after. So they had bought a startup called Infrared, and right when they bought them, I joined and helped build out the product. So I didn't do the initial R&D or anything, but I helped build out the product for 5 years or so.
Is that the one that Jim Manico created?
Yeah, Manico, and there was a couple of other folks over there. Yeah. And actually, yeah, I knew Jim from OWASP. I had no idea that Jim was even working for a startup. And I sent Jim a note. Somebody else in my sphere saw that they got acquired, and I sent Jim a note and I said, "Hey man, congrats. Didn't even know you had a company. Good job." And Jim, in his usual Jim way, responded by saying, "Oh, thanks, man. Do you Python?" And I said, "What? Did you mean to respond to me with, do you Python?" And he said, "Yeah, do you want to come work for us?" Oh, okay. And so that turned into a job. And I couldn't pass up working for Jim, so it was a great 5 years. I learned a lot. It's a hard space, but it's a fascinating, interesting space. We definitely don't take advantage of the capabilities that exist there. Super fascinating area. Semgrep solves a lot of the things that I like about it. Not everything, but solves a lot of the things. And also today, I want to make a strong point that I'm not going to talk about vendor stuff publicly. If people want to talk vendors, I do it offline. That's been a rule I've had my whole career. I will talk about open source stuff, but also there's vendors for all of these things, some good, some bad. And, I just am not going to talk about vendors. I don't like that particular pitch model. So you won't see any vendor things today. So where have we been? What have we tried? Well, we've tried all of these things, right? We've tried to pen test our way to security, and there's still lots of teams that do this. We've tried to compliance our way to security, and then we've tried, DAS, SAST, IS. these things in and of themselves are not bad things. Certainly we do all of these things. You know, most organizations seem to do some flavor or bits and pieces of all of these things. They're not bad things, but they're not solutions in and of themselves, right? If I hand you a compliance report, I think compliance is probably, or maybe arguably, the closest to getting you a checkbox at the end, but certainly it's not what we want, right? If you sat down and said, what do I want out of my program? Compliance is not the only thing that we want to achieve. Compliance enables, you know, opens doors. It makes sure that we're at least hitting certain minimum bars, but it's not our goal. And I would even argue that the superset of all these things is not what we want, right? We haven't actually stated goals and metrics to track, but we've tried lots of these things. So what do we want? I've heard all of these, so that's why I put them on here. Security like it'll be like in year 21X, right? We want to be super forward thinking. And a specific version of that is post-quantum, something. Okay, I don't even know what a definition for any of these things is, but I've heard these words. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got enough security not to get fired, right? Basically, and I've had bosses tell me this in the past, not my current boss, he's great, but bosses in the past have said, I just don't want to see our name on the CNN ticker. That's your job. Well, okay, fair enough, but that's not a program goal. Another one that's super common, and I think a lot of us struggle with this, secure like, you know, pick a company, FANG or any of those companies within. What we don't often realize, and some of what I'll try to talk about today, is if you drop into Google, there's an ecosystem there. There's a culture, there's a company ethos, there's company size, there's products and tools and processes and yada yada. All those things matter and help us structure what we're going to achieve at the end, or maybe not what, but how we're going to achieve it. And so copying, or what I often see is, oh, company X released a new open source tool, we've got to do the thing because the company did. Well, okay, maybe maybe that's the right solution for you, but I don't buy it. That's not my approach. For instance, I'm not gonna security like Facebook if I'm a regulated healthcare company. That's just fundamentally, there's an impedance mismatch there. That's fundamentally not what I want to do. So this is my rough outline for what I'm trying to achieve, right? And we talked about this a little bit getting set up. First, I have to know what we have. Then I have to define some measure of risk around those things. Then I need to understand in my environment, how do I trade off that risk against business value, right? That's a large part of what risk management is, which implies that I need to understand what my business value is. And then once I've got all those things, right, that's all the setup. And I would make the argument that everything that was on that previous slide of, you know, pen test, compliance, yada, yada, everything there was in this first three buckets, mostly in that second bucket of like defining how risky a given asset is. I think the industry struggles with finding out what assets we own in large enterprises, which has been my background. And then we really are not great generally at risk trade-offs to the business. But we really don't even oftentimes talk about how do we actually drive the risk down systemically. And so I'm going to try to walk through some of these things and just jot down some ideas for how we think about it, or how I think about it. So how do we go through and find out?
Just on this one, just a
Yep.
point. I think a big area is also that understand the threat landscape, right?
Sure, this is true.
Because when you add the threat landscape, you know, it really allows you to plug in whatever instance you already had, but also take into account who's attacking you, right? I think sometimes in security we kind of fall for the fact that yes, it is possible given a certain type of attacker, a certain type of time, a certain type of scenario. But the reality is, is that happening? Is that realistic, right? And it's almost understanding what are the things that we really need to focus on versus the things that we could focus on that could be insanely dangerous, but there's no threat about it.
Yep. And Yes, that's a good point. I'll try to touch on that a little bit here with the kind of understanding what the attack space looks like as gauging how risky certain assets are, or as an input to that calculation. But yeah, the classic answer has been like, pen test always wins over SAST because pen test is a real finding. And then, but there's also, my answer has always been, I need production traffic, right? And the reason I need production traffic, because if two things are equally risky, right, for some definition of risky, if one of them's actively being attacked and the other's not, I want to focus on one more than the other, right? It helps me slide that dot or that knob or turn that knob or whatever. So yeah, that's certainly something we have to consider. So how do we know what assets we have? I'm going to argue for kind of 1A and 1B, and then 2. So 1A and B, these are things I believe. One of the things that frustrated me most particularly when Netflix came on the scene and started doing, like, their security team started doing talks, I was super jealous because they were doing really interesting things, and I'm going, how have you solved all the upfront stuff? And then maybe 4 or 5 talks in, they had 2 talks back to back, and they presented interesting stuff their security team did, and then their security team presented some kind of operational things that were just base model, and they were saying words like, we only have our people coding in 1 or 2 languages, and they only use 1 framework, and they only deploy on 1 system. We have a common kind of like a golden master image. We have 1 deployment CI/CD pipeline. 1. So consolidation was part and parcel of the operational and dev environment that they were in. I don't think it can be kind of overstated how much this simplifies life, right? And so, in my day job, I work a lot on this, trying to drive down to consolidated things. I think this is really important. And that's not just for your infrastructure things, that's also for your programming model, right? Netflix also, same group, talks about freedom but responsibility. You have the freedom to choose if you're at Netflix. I think their stacks, last I heard, were kind of JVM based and JavaScript, NPM based. You can go do Ruby if you want, but you have to check all the same boxes in Ruby that are pre-checked for you in JVM. And so that's a powerful incentive to drive teams towards the common things, because otherwise they have to do all those things themselves, support them themselves, and they're signing up for a lot of work. So if we can limit languages, frameworks, technologies, we want to enable people to move quickly and build things that are interesting and bleeding edge and all those kinds of things. But every new thing accretes support. This is just not security risk. This is operational risk, because, if you introduce a new platform, who operates and supports that thing, and how do you debug that thing? How do you log? How do you audit? Like all the stuff, all the monitoring and everything, all those things get accreted with every new thing in the stack. So simplify wherever you can. And then asset inventory, right? There's a lot of commercial companies that are playing in the space right now. I've been calling this a mass. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but there's an OS project that's pretty stinking popular in this space. And this is dynamic asset inventory. I'll talk next about a static asset inventory tool or set of tools, but this one's dynamic. But my point here is, more data rarely harms you, right? I want to make better decisions, so I need more data. I'll stop there because I've been running my mouth for a few minutes. Any thoughts, questions?
Exactly. Any comments from the audience? This is an interactive session, guys.
I talk quickly. So
OWASP MS, isn't it for your online stuff rather than asset inventory? It forms part of it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's trying to come from the outside looking in, right? So if I am, mycompany.com, you feed in some environmental production asset metadata, like these are my domains, these are my certificates, yada yada, and it'll try to pivot around the world and say it'll help you answer questions like, oh, you've got this DNS record and it's got this technical contact. I pivoted over and I found these other DNS records that are owned by the same technical contact. Is that also you? There was a really great talk a few years ago, Peleus Yulee from Adobe, where Adobe, right? I mean, they had a solid security team, but he set up a Tiger team to go off and look at this problem. This was 5 years ago, to look at this problem. And they ended up more than doubling the amount of domains that they knew about because they built some automation to do these types of things. It's an important step to look outside in, but then inside out is also helpful. So anything you can do to inventory assets, hardware, software, cloud, yada, yada. Like we have to think about it at every layer of the stack. It's everywhere. And so we need more tools in this space. People should be building these things. If you're on a single cloud provider, some of this stuff comes automatically or programmatically, I guess, if you build things in. But not all of us get to play in that space. Some of us are multi-cloud, some of us are cloud data center on-prem. So we need to think about these things deeply. There's just
hey, John, on that topic, have you found a good schema to use? So we've played around with using Jira for that, and we play around with using JSON files that we add to each repo to capture the metadata of that repo, which is then consumed, and then we try to create graphs out of it. Have you found a good schema to represent those assets?
So we're, I would say, early days. We're immature. We are working on this problem, and we have taken the approach, like I've copied some other people who are, in my opinion, doing some smart things. And we're doing kind of the security YAML, security JSON file in the root of the repo. This plays to kind of the psychology of it too, but my opinion is that helps drive ownership with teams, consistency across the org, and helps them make declarative statements in their environment. Now that introduces problems like how do you keep it updated? What data goes in there? How do you get started? All those kinds of things. But that's the approach we're taking, and it seems to be working well thus far. But then you do have to parse and extract out that data. You have to process it. You have to dashboard it. You have to collect all kinds. You still have to have. You have to consume that data and make it usable and useful. But it lets you do interesting. Let you answer some of the other thing that did for us as opposed to trying to define it purely technically was it lets us answer things like, is this product internet facing, right? Like you can't define that from looking at SAST. I mean, you might be able to, but probably not. Is this, how many customer records are managed by this product, right? A lot of those things are harder to kind of understand. And so I like the security JSON, but we're still early days. So I'm not going to, put my flag in the sand on that, but I think it's a good approach for now.
John, two questions. First one is if you integrate AMAS within your pipelines, or how often do you think asset discovery should run, let's say, in an organization? That's one. And the other one is if as a part of asset inventory, do you actually use dependency track as well, dependency tracking?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about dependency track in a minute, or in a few minutes. But yeah, we like dependency track. And like I said, I'm not going to talk vendors. We do open source and vendor things in all of these spaces, right? Or not all, but several of these spaces. And so, so for AMAS, I think it's obviously org specific. If you are a company that's doing, hundreds of acquisitions a year, you might want to run it daily. If you're if you're an org that's pretty static, weekly might be fine for you, or monthly even. I don't, we tend to run some things daily, some things weekly. That tends to work for us. We are at a scale where that's computable. I mean, we have to throw some hardware resources behind it, but we're at a scale where that's workable as a solution. And I'm sorry,
yeah, I think that's pretty much
okay.
Right. Probably the third question is, sorry for asking so many questions, but
no, go please.
The outcome of that analysis that you run from AMAS or AMAS, I don't know, I'm a Spanish speaker.
Yeah.
Where do you manage that? Maybe as Dennis was asking, is it Jira based, or do you use any specific tool for managing that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's one thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit more. So, I don't have this in the deck, so you'll just have to take my word for it. I don't have pictures. At the very end, I talk about like what we think, or what I think rather, is a reasonable like set of injection points, right? If you look at the DevSecOps, and I'm really looking forward to y'all's opinion on my picture there. But if you look at that and you think about, I think of it like a blackboard, right? This concept that you think about when you're doing static analysis. So when you're doing static analysis, it's based on compiler technology, right? Like you take your code and you build up a graph essentially, or a tree structure, and then you start walking the tree, but you have to start making comments at different points, right? Like you start annotating the tree along the way. So that's in my brain. And so if you think about, and Dennis has had lots of great talks and thoughts about how do we think about these things in graphs because they're connected. O2 was, certainly it was and is pioneering work in the space. You have to have something, right? And some people try to answer this with GRC. I've never been a fan. We've got an internal thing. There are tools like OWASP had one, and it's flaking on my mind, like the aggregators, right? It's not. It used to be ThreadFix, and there's a new one. What's the new ThreadFix at OWASP? What's the project? I can't think of it for the life of me. There's the guy down in Texas who runs it. Oh, anyway, things like ThreadFix, where you're basically taking the output of your scans and you're putting them in one centralized place and you're trying to normalize that data. You got to have something like that, in my opinion. I think I like Jira tickets, or whatever product you're using, because that puts you in the developer space. But you got to have something that's doing the kind of, first of all, normalization, and second of all, like if your scan, if you scan and you had 10 issues and then you scan the next time you have 9, you should auto close that ticket with a comment that the thing was updated. So you have to do the normalization and correlation and reconciliation processes and everything. But if you have that thing, I like to think of it like a tree or a graph or a blackboard, where it's just a place I can throw interesting data. One of the hard problems that comes out of that is I've got to have a way to find the thread through the systems. That's not what this talk is about. I think it's an interesting other talk, and more than happy in like a panel to talk about that. I think that's a interesting hard problem, because really what I want to have is from the time the requirements are being thought about, I want to track this component, whatever, for some definition of component, from there through to the running system to the decommed system. And I want to be able to follow that flow all the way through, which means I've got to have SAST and DAST and IAST. I've also got to have running logs in production. I also want to know things about CI/CD. I also want to know pen tests. Like, I want to have a place that gives me all that information, but I've got to somehow thread the needle to know that this thing in this system and this thing in this other system are the same thing. So I think that's a unique, interesting problem that comes up when you start talking asset inventory, because one piece of code might run, 50 instances in production. Those are all the same thing, and they have lots of data about them, but I care about all of those things. Does that make sense? A lot of words to say a little bit of stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing that you just need to add to there is that I think we need to define the concept of application. Yeah. Right. Because I think in a lot of places we still try to talk about the application as the actual bit of code or almost the traditional app. But these days, what I try to tell out to my team is that the applications, it's almost an empty, starts on an empty cloud environment. Everything you need to spin up in order to run it is part of your application. Right. Yep. Because if you don't take that into account, like you said, you only have certain visibility into what's going on, and there's lots of pieces of the puzzle that are missing, right?
Yep. And there's a fundamental impedance mismatch, right? Because when you pen test something, you pen test the application, but on the other side, that might be a bunch of cloud functions, a bunch of lambdas, a bunch of microservices, external company, products that you've bought and have integrated. And so some of your systems are going to be at one granularity, and some of your systems are going to report at another one. So that's what I'm saying. That threading that needle is really, really hard. it's definitely not solved by us. I don't think anybody else is really, there's probably some people who have gone a lot further than we have, but I don't think it's a solved problem. It's an interesting problem. I don't think it's solved.
Yeah, but it's definitely one that I think can add a lot of value. And also it's one that is interesting that can, even from a business point of view, help to reduce costs, right? In cloud thing, right? So there's an interesting alignment there in the business.
Yeah, for sure. So here's a tool. There's bunches of them like it. Threadfix had a version. I think there's a OWASP tool or two that also does this. But the idea here is when I'm SASting, right, during CI or whenever you do your SAST, I can inspect source code and generate route metadata. That's a useful primitive to me, right? If I've got something that exposes a route, whether that's a Lambda or whether it's a monolith or a API or whatever it is, if I can capture the route information, there's lots of usages for that. Two that we use are, one is we use this to feed our testing approaches, right? Whether it's DAST or pen test or whatever it is. Another is for trend information. So you suddenly went from three routes in your system to 10. Tell me about that. That's an interesting change. What happened? What did you do? Another thing here is, because we can derive parameters, we can do some basic heuristics and say, hey, it looks like you have a Boolean flag here that sounds like admin. What is that? And so we can start to ask interesting questions. And so I think this is a fundamental primitive is really helpful. And there's lots that can be done with SAS, lots that can be done with DAST to extract out some of this data. And if we can get lots and lots and lots of little pieces of data like this, yes, we have to be thoughtful about how we compose them, but the sum of the parts is super valuable. And then at the end, what I want that doesn't exist today, but like my final, what I want at the end is my favorite programming language, bar none, is SQL. I know that's a silly thing to say, or maybe it's not, but it's an incredibly powerful thing. And if I can, just like OS query, right, where I took all these disparate things, the sum of their parts is greater. If I can start asking questions and doing joins across this kind of data across my infrastructure, that would be an incredibly powerful thing, I think. And there's some SaaS companies that are starting to let you do this kind of thing, SQL, on code, but I want it on code. I want it on metadata about my applications, all those kinds of things. I am not tracking the chat, by the way. I'm going to stop and ask, am I supposed to be doing that?
No, I'm tracking it for you,
very
don't
good.
worry.
All right, awesome, thank you. Here's another tool. Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
As you asked that question, Andre made a comment, so let me just read it.
Yeah.
Vocabulary band variables words from today are path, file name, file. Hoping to make life. I think he was making a joke. Okay.
Okay.
For that one, right. I did enjoy this too. I was thinking that in programming, this will actually have to come in just to make your life harder, because the introspection is brilliant, and to ask the questions, it's extremely educative towards somebody that actually doesn't know the source code, but actually gives me the idea that, yeah, I should totally ban those words from actually having it in JSON objects or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, fair point. It's open source. If you want to like push a ticket to us or change it, that's fine. I'm not deeply tied to this. It was one of those deals where it's like we needed something, we made it and gave it away. So I think this is a useful primitive. Another that we've done, now this one's only for Java libraries, but you could steal the idea and do it for lots of places, is looking at dependency relationships. So the way to read this, and I won't go too deeply into it, but I'm going to intro it because in a couple slides, there's an interesting use case. This says that in WebGoat, there's this class file server that directly, it's part of the user, which this is a moniker for custom code, that directly calls Apache Commons IO file utils. Now, these chains can get pretty long because we do the transitive pathing. But if you imagine that Commons IO called Commons utils and Commons utils called Commons, file uploader, you would see this chain along the way. The question we were trying to answer was, who is using what and can we get rid of things? That was our original use case, but collecting this data turned out to be really powerful. So what this tool does is it scans your jar files, looks for connections between them, you know, doing bytecode analysis, looking for static calls between either libraries to themselves or libraries to other libraries at the class level, and then builds a graph database based on it. Then you can go in and ask questions of the graph database, which are interesting. So this turns out to be really useful, and there's kind of a pretty print graph, which is maybe useless, but sure real pretty to look at. I didn't build that, but I really like it.
By the way, if anybody's into C#, the O2 platform also has a lot of this stuff. I need to revise the O2 platform, man.
You need to get a marketing person for it, because there's a lot there. I don't think people realize how much is actually there. So this we have running in CI. It builds the graph all the time, and then we run the queries kind of once a week. And this helps us drive conversations with our internal teams to say, one thing that we also have is some basic metrics or you know, statistics that get computed. Like, you are using this library exposes 1,000 public functions, you are using 2 of them. Or this library exposes 20 public functions, you're using 18 of them. So we can answer questions like, how tightly coupled are you to this library? And, you know, actually I'll skip ahead and then come back. Let's see. Yeah, so on this slide here, what we found when we were doing this third-party library usage is, when we did this original analysis, we found 5 libraries that were using 1 or 2 functions each. And all 5 of them, the only 1 or 2 functions we were using were base64 encode or decode. Now, base64 encode decode is part of the standard library. And we had to go back to our dev teams and go, why did you pick this one? And we were able to throw away 5 libraries, right, that were on this particular monolith that we had. And that reduces attack surface, build time, operation. Like, it helps in a lot of things that dev cares about, but it also helps us reduce attack surface and simplifies the system. But we wouldn't have been able to tell them that had we not had tooling like this. So this, this data enables you to ask lots of interesting questions. Okay, so here's a bunch of questions you could ask. Where are my apps? Or, what are my apps? Is it internet facing? What's the number of records? Yada, yada. There's lots of questions. Some of them you can divine automatically with software. Some you have to get from humans. To the conversation earlier, we're trying the security YAML, security JSON approach. I may update in a year and say that's terrible. It didn't work out for us. But others have tried it and they seem to be sticking with it. So, and those are smart people that I respect. So we're going to give that a shot at first. Okay, so next, how do we know how risky these are? So this is our bread and butter, I think, as security people, lots of things that we do here. But we think about it: design, implementation. Implementation is where most of the tools we have are, and then attack. So really, I think about it this way. Paved paths and guardrails. I'm not going to harp on this because Clint's talk does much better, but this is fundamentally how we think about things. And then we want to automate whatever we can, but then in paved paths, we don't want to just give them paved paths. We want to do assertions, right? Or, measuring invariance. We want to declare things that, if we have an architecture thing, arc unit is something we've used. And what this says is, if we have an architectural invariant that we want to enforce, we can put a tool in place to enforce that invariant. And so I think that's a really powerful usage of SAS. This is where semgrep is, in my opinion, really, really helpful. It's a really powerful usage of the SAS technology. It's just flipping the idea on its head. Instead of finding lots of bad things, it's really find anything that's not the good thing, right? So I think that fundamental intuition is really, really super powerful. And we try to use it a lot. So there's things you can do at the design phase. There's things you can do at the implementation phase. And we'll talk about some of these on the implementation phase. Again, going back to simplification, pick things carefully, across the entire stack. I talked about the third-party library analyzer. to the earlier question around dependency check, dependency track, if I had to pick maybe 4 places to start, my recommend, that are low-hanging fruit, right? Certainly pen test and DAS tools would fall in here as a 5th that I didn't list, but I think that the tooling in this space has matured to a level I would have these things. The first is third-party libraries, because that's banana pants for most organizations, and you got to get that under control. The second is secrets finding. I wrote a tool for this. There are many, many good tools for this. I put it out there because it was mine and this is my talk. And so go pick one. Lots of them are good. Lots of them hook into the Git workflow as Git hooks. Mine does not, for a specific reason, but it's just kind of scanning file directories. But any of the Git hook things is probably the better right place to get there. But yeah, you should have something looking for secrets. Find static analysis tooling. There's obviously vendors in this space. There's lots of open source things that are language specific though, and those are great. And then semgrep. We'll talk a lot about
for the second tool. Is it possible to integrate that with GitHub or Git hooks? Maybe to start scanning at the time of checking in. Is it possible?
What was the question around the secrets finding?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you can hook on, at Git, so you can start scanning before committing.
Yeah, and most of, and I'll tell briefly why my tool exists. Most tools work that way. Almost all the popular ones that I could find work that way. They hook into the Git hook process, which I think is, if you're starting from, you need that. Like you need that scanning from start. My problem was we had a lot of legacy code. I still want to find that, and we have a lot of tools that are not using Git, right? Like that's just not an option, or they're not on the same implementation or whatever it is. So I needed something where I could pull the code out no matter what the system was and still find secrets. And so that's why this tool exists. I leverage all the rules from those other tools. I just kind of, not all the other tools, but from any that have a friendly license that would let me do it. I leverage their rules. I didn't try to write any good new custom rules. I just scan directories basically. And so that's why that tool exists. But yeah, there's lots of great ones that hook into the Git process, and you should have that at least, right? Or in addition. So really good point. So the next 2 slides are for like how this process works, right? How do you do this binding between, I have some automation and I have these paid paths. How do I do this enforcement? What does the thought process look like? So I've got to define rules, and in particular, I got to find rules that are organization specific. This is a really key intuition. This is what lets you move powerfully, right? If this wasn't important, you could just use any scanning tool on earth, right? If you're on AWS, you should absolutely use the AWS tool, scanning tools that tell you these are best practices and whatever. But if your organization, the example I like to use here is if you're in a language and framework and you've got, say 10 ORM frameworks, right? This is not too hard to imagine. If you've got 10, there's safe and unsafe ways to do things in all 10. And this is what SaaS vendors have to deal with. They have to look at all of them and build rules for all of them. Your organization should be using one. And so the rules you can write are, here's what's safe and unsafe in that one. Anything in any of the other frameworks is unsafe, right? It may not technically be unsafe, but it's banned in my organization. And so that intuition lets you say, exclude everything else, put some guardrails, everything else is out of my view so I can stay focused. That lets me move fast, that lets me only support certain things. And so this has turned out to be a really powerful intuition here. The other thing is, Dennis, to your point earlier, like if we want to create value for dev, this is super powerful because they think about clean code, linting, quality, right? If you can support fewer things but support those fewer things well, this is a huge carrot for dev as opposed to the stick. So you can help, bring technology stacks in that say, hey, look, we can help you enforce. You don't want that thing to happen. Look, here's how you do that. We've got the tooling set up, or we can work with you to help with the tooling. We have gotten more excitement out of our dev team than our security team on some of these rules, because they're like, oh, thank you. I can now enforce this for hundreds or thousands of people, and I can do it with automation instead of, you know, weird distributed code review guidelines that nobody follows and those kind of things, right? So if I can actually enforce these things, it turns out to be really powerful.
John.
Yep.
Before we move on, we have a question about whether you have some articles pointing to this setup. I think this was asked just as you moved into this slide. So I am not sure if it's for the previous slide or this one.
Okay, so for both, actually, I think the thing I referenced at the very beginning, the talk that Clint gave a couple RSAs ago, is better and going to say more things than I would say, but the framework of ideas is basically the same. And I should have said this at the beginning. If anybody wants to talk about these things, I love talking about these things. And so, you know, ping me offline. I don't really have articles published. I used to write a lot. I got 3 youngins, and so I don't write publicly so much anymore. I try to spend all my off time with them. But if people are interested in this topic, I certainly would consider putting together an article that frames some of these things in long form, or, you know, written format. It might be valuable. But I don't have anything I can point you to other than there's a couple of good talks from Clint that I would basically, you know, thumbs up strongly.
And we could open a semgrep channel in our Slack, and you guys can chat about this there.
Yeah, and I've got we're almost to the like semgrep screenshots of what I've done and a few, like, you know, use case examples. So this is what semgrep in particular has enabled us to do, right? For anybody who's worked with classic tooling, I'll call it, you know, classic, legacy, whatever, you know that some of these steps are not easy. So let's say you know, no matter what your model is, whether you're embedding with teams, whether you're just, you know, consulting, whatever it is, you've joined some code review, or you're looking at some code, you found some issues. You want to, you know, if you're an approver on a code review, your timeline's really short. If you're just doing a meandering code review, fine. But if you're an approver, your timeline is short. So you've identified some issue. The one really powerful thing about semgrep is the developer experience, right? So in order to, the way you start writing a rule for semgrep is you copy the offending code and you paste it into their editor, and then you start editing the rule. Right? And the rules are really simple to write. The next slide shows one of the rules. But you start with copy pasting the offending code, and then you just start replacing variable names. And I think Clint's done a talk here where he kind of showed some of that off. But there's definitely, you know, their guidance shows how to do this and what this looks like. The important thing is it can happen at speed. So during the code review, I can actually write the rule and ensure that the tool finds the issue in that code review. Like that, right? Because writing the rules is fast, running the rules are fast, and you can run it on one file. So you make sure, right, that the feedback loop is immediate. And so this is really helpful, right? O2 does this kind of thing, right? It's super fast. Then if you're in the middle of a code review that you have to approve, you make your comment, you move on. But the important bit is that you go back and follow up. And now, right, because we need a common space, and this is where, you know, we built some internal proprietary stuff that kind of scans everything at scale. But if you're in an organization that uses, you know, GitHub Enterprise, you can add this to your thing. I think there's some, I think R2C sells some vendor tooling that kind of will help you do this. But the important bit is that this now gets fed in or loaded in to your project. So an example will help. So here's an example, right? Certainly R2C probably has or, you know, the open source package has an unsafe use of MD5, but we rewrote all of them. Any ones we were interested in. Not because we think their tools or their rules are bad. We still run their rules, but because we have a higher bar, right? We can't just accept random community rules and trust them. So we kind of migrate those rules over to a different rule set that's more codified for our internal things, because if we're going to cut tickets based on rules, or we're going to block code reviews based on these rules, we want to be confident in them. So what you can do, I'm going to run through this real quickly. You know, you can see, right, we're doing unsafe MD5. You can see the code is super simple here, right? This is not clever. This is copy paste, real simple things. And so this is how you define the thing. But what I really want to focus on is this bit here. One of the nice things about semgrep in particular is this metadata block. If I ever build another tool, I am going to put this metadata concept everywhere I go, because when you write the rule, they have a generic key value pairing of metadata, and it just passes through into the finding. They literally copy paste it into the finding. And so when you get the finding exported as JSON, you get all of this metadata. So when we run semgrep, catch the results on the other side, we can parse back out this data. And so what you'll see here is, we've got confidence, we've got scope. So confidence, straightforward. Scoping is, do we want to run this on specific applications or everything? Status is this considered a dev, test, or prod rule, or dev, QA, prod? If it's prod, we have certain functions or workflows that go through. If it's in development, we might have a dashboard that lets us, look at just the development rules so that we can quickly analyze whether or not they're working well and see the stats and that kind of thing. But if it's production, we might block code reviews based on it, or we might cut tickets based on it, those kind of things. So that's important for us. The tools, we use this in code review, we use this in our kind of after the fact pure CI scanning, both in blocking asynchronous. We use this in the IDE. So is this rule applicable everywhere? Is this rule applicable to just in the IDE? So we can be flexible there. And then the last thing that's really nice is, depending on the environment, right? I'll show the IDE plugin here in a minute. Depending on the environment, we can put references. You can imagine a workflow in the IDE. If you poke in a reference for a link to a training video, that person they're doing the coding, they get a red squiggle, they mouse over it, it tells them what to do, and it says, if you want to know how to fix this, go watch this training video. That's a super powerful primitive in my mind, right? We can pass this through. So this is MD5. Here's another example. Hey, MD5 is looking for a vuln. This is really just looking for interesting metadata again. We, and in this case, we would switch tools to be maybe, just the non-blocking right at the end, because we were really just collecting information maybe. Or we might put this in code review and at the end. We're not necessarily going to block a build because of it, because you added something new, but we do want to say, go get the security engineering team to review it. Another example here, certainly dependency track is, or Cyclone, dependency check, whatever your tool is a good way to catch this. But we also found that we were doing a review and somebody saw a reference to Commons HTTP client v3, which has been out of support for 12, 13 years. So it was pretty easy because the namespace was different. We have the flexibility to say, oh, this is a bad namespace. Now it's just like a banned rule. So what happened here? We're doing a code review. We see a bad thing. We updated the rule. We put it in testing for a couple of weeks. When this moves and gets promoted to prod, what that'll mean is we found one problem one time on one piece of code. But now, once it gets promoted, every person who's running this IDE plugin, every code review in our company, that uses whatever the Java language, every CI scan that's configured and hooked up properly gets this rule, and it's everywhere, right? And nobody should be able to go through and say, oh yeah, Commons HTTP client is fine. And then once it's in production, we'll actually cut tickets to close out Commons HTTP client, right? So yeah, we really, really like this capability. So any questions on the rules before I show the IDE? Right, no questions. Okay, so there's an IDE plugin. You can go grab it. It's just for IntelliJ. semgrep, the company behind them, R2C, they also have a VS Code plugin. So if you're a VS Code person, they support one. I wrote this one because we're an IntelliJ shop and they didn't have an IntelliJ one. It's really, really, really dumb. There's not much there, but it works. And so, complain about it, use it, try it, don't try it, whatever's fine. But if you have needs, let us know. But it's real straightforward. You can install it. It's on the plugin marketplace. You point me to, so this is it's an external tool. It's not, semgrep is not loaded into your IDE. You install semgrep on your machine and then you point the plugin to this tool, and there's a little wrapper script that I show you how to create on the GitHub page. And then you point me to a directory. The way semgrep works with rules, you can have a rules file or a rules directory, and it will recursively go through all the rules files that you have in that directory. So here's what it looks like. We've got a little bit of code. I commented out this code, for the sake of this demo to show that it's not good. This is actually the Commons HTTP client example, commented out. When you uncomment it, you get a nice little red squiggle because you're using a thing, and you mouse over it and you get the finding, right? Nothing particularly clever. The same example here for your MD5 example. Uncomment that code. Now you get the little red squiggle, and it tells you, MD5 hashing, MD5's weak, right? But the point is you're doing the same semgrep thing, just in your IDE. And the VS Code thing works very equivalently. So if folks are interested in other IDEs,
I was just going to ask that, John. If
yell at R2C.
To do that for NetBeans, for example.
I've never built NetBeans plugins, but honestly, a month ago, I'd never built, 2 months ago, I'd never built a IntelliJ plugin, and I did that in a week, because it's really, you can go look at the code. There's probably 50 real lines of code. It's basically, shell out and call this OS command and pass it these parameters, parse the JSON when it comes back, and show it in the little, warnings thing or, findings. So there's not much there. I've not built NetBeans, but if people are interested, I can give it a shot in my free time. It's not something we use internally, so I don't have a pure incentive. And if somebody else, really likes IntelliJ and wants to add features, pull requests, file tickets, take over the project for all I care. Well, maybe not. I do care, making sure it's a decent person taking over a project, but the goal was to get something in our organization that would do this thing, right? There are other vendors in this space, and we actually use one of them internally. Part of my driver here was to show that this is a powerful primitive, and we need security companies to provide this capability, right? We need this. There are already, most of the commercial vendors for SaaS have an IDE plugin, but really it's like, most of them are wonky, I find, and it show the findings that were scanned in CI, and line numbers get off, and it's kind of painful a lot of times. What I want is invariant enforcement in my IDE, right? And so I want more of these types of things. So I'm trying to get the market to go out there and do it. So yeah. And then here's my DevSecOps slide. I used to work for the US government, and I just put this version of the slide because, apropos of nothing, I can tell this is a US government slide without without knowing where it came from. This is just so US government, it's not funny. I love it. It's the worst. But my point in saying all that is, or bringing up this slide in particular, is you could go through this as an exercise with your team and think about, oh, what data could we get out of threat modeling? What data could we collect when we're doing secure code reviews or in secure coding and training? What data could we do when we're actually implementing, infrastructure as code or security as code pipelines or compliance as code, yada, yada. What data can we get out of security monitoring, right? Like our security operations teams, what data from that environment, if you're a Elk or Splunk or whatever product you're using, or your WAFs or your, products in that space, RASP type products, what can I pull out that, and I can thread that needle over here to data that I got out of code reviews or SaaS or whatever it is, right? You can walk around all of these things, and we've got to think about how to tie those things together. It's a big, hard problem, but it's fun, in my opinion. Okay, so I take, so Denise, to your original question, thinking about the threat environment, certainly threat intel is a super powerful, there's open source and vendor things playing in the space, but we've also got things built in like WAFs, right? people have strong opinions, but they are a data point that can tell you about what the world looks like. Instrumentation, logging, monitoring. There's all these types of tools that we probably already have, but we may or may not be leveraging them, looking at holistically, how do they affect our data? By the way, just as a slide check, we're on slide 33. I have 7 left, and we're wrapping up pretty quickly. So I'm almost done for people. How do we calculate risk trade-offs? That's not the point of this talk, but I think it's important just to touch on real quickly. There's a great talk from AppSec 2017, AppSec USA 2017. I think this is the Twilio folks, if memory serves. But regardless of who gave it, this was a really, really good talk. And I thought they had some interesting metrics that they were collecting and gathering that were more mature than most talks that I see, and really just a unique way of thinking about it. So I highly recommend that one. If you haven't heard of FAIR, it's lots of people say it's a boring topic to get through, but you need some kind of mechanism for valuing, your assets and being able to make those business trade-offs. Different organizations, different verticals are going to have different ways of going about these. These are just things you should think about, in my opinion. And lastly, how do we drive, right? This is pay dirt, right? How do we drive risk lower with the things that we've done above, right? When we get to this point, really, we've not changed the risk at all, right? I think that's the point I want to make here. We haven't actually changed anything. We just collected a bunch of data. If you know all your assets, if you know how risky they are, and if you are able to compare quantitatively, qualitatively against the business, you've just set yourself up for making changes. You haven't made any substantive changes yet, right? I mean, if you're blocking builds, maybe that's some substantive changes, but you've got a pile of problems at the end that you still have to walk through and lower the risk. So there's people and process things that we can do. My main point here, right? Like, training's great, embedding's great, champions are great. Whether you go top down, bottom up, or both, a lot of these things are about your organization. And so my recommendation is match the program to the organization. This is my original, a healthcare company and Facebook probably going to run a little different. And that's part of what we do, is understand our org and what's going to work and not going to work there. Sometimes it's trying something, failing, and trying again until we find something that works. And I've done more than my fair share of that. But at the end of the day, we want to, through people and process, we want to foster a culture of security. One of my favorite things to talk about is in the original Salter and Schrader kind of core principles paperback from the 70s, early 70s. Their last bullet point is, when they were saying these are the core security primitives like least privilege and fail closed and those kind of things. Their last one was make it psychologically acceptable. And that is the most upsetting set of words I think that I've heard in security. And it also explains why a lot of teams are the way they are. It's like, just get to the minimum bar. Our security architect at my company rephrased that when he built out our internal documentation, rephrased it to make security lovable, right? And I like that a lot better than psychologically acceptable. We want security to not impede the business. We rather want to be enablers, and we rather want to, you've heard people talk about get to the yes. We want to enable people to move quickly in the right direction. And honestly, we don't want to be people. I like the notion of guardrails. We don't want to be people standing at the bottom of the hill going, stop, and putting everybody in a 50-car pileup. We'd rather just install guardrails, and so people can have safe traffic. We want to make it safe for our internal customers, our development staff, and external customers and users, and we want to support all those things. But we don't want to be standing in the middle of the road at the end, right? And so that's, in my opinion, what we're driving at with people and processes. I've talked about all these things, but this is more of a summary. I try to talk about all of these different places are important. In the IDE, we want to do things in seconds. In code review, we might have seconds to minutes, depending on your org. In CI, if you're going to block, you're probably upper bounded by minutes. And then if we're going to do asynchronous CI or something after the fact, right? It might be okay to do certain things in days. I don't know. In your org, it might be weeks or months. I don't know. tend to doubt that, but days may be fine. I don't know. And then you've got to follow up with, vuln management for any asynchronous findings. If you can block these things in the top 3 buckets, you don't really have to do vuln management. You might still want to collect metrics, so you certainly still want to collect metrics, so you know how you did drive change, and you can talk about that and show the success. But if you do things after the fact, you have to follow up, right? And I'm a strong believer in meet and dev where they are. So for us, this is Jira tickets or whatever their equivalent would be for you. And then for us, semgrep is in all these places. Again, you saw the knobs we were turning earlier, but semgrep fits all of these, right? It is a better grep and a less complete full SaaS solution, but it works in all these places. It's fast enough to be done in seconds or minutes in code reviews and IDE because our scope is so much smaller. It's even fast enough to do in minutes if you scope the rule set down when you're doing CI, right? Because relative to the overall runtime, right? If you're going to run actual tests, it's not that, it does not take that long to do semgrep comparatively. And certainly you can kind of throw the kitchen sink of rules if you're going to do it asynchronously. So we like semgrep quite a lot, and obviously are investing in it. So last slide, you got to know your business. You have to know what you have. Aggressively narrow what you support, and then once you know what you have and what those paved paths are, work towards creating invariants that are enforceable by technology, right? Because then it moves into an auto thing, and then you start continually drive towards paved paths. Not part of this talk, but things like safe libraries. Again, we're doing crypto. We have one supported crypto framework. Maybe we shim a library or API on top of it. Then we write invariants to enforce that. So now we've got the full flow, and we show anything outside of that. And you can continue to scope down the things that people have to worry about. It seems like a formula for success. It's helped us a lot. We're still, like I said, I'm going to call it early days, but it has made an appreciable impact on dev. And one thing I failed to mention when we were going through here, dev has really, when I said dev latched onto a lot of these things, the head of engineering really latched onto the idea that by minimization and enforcement, that helps me a lot with hiring, because my new people come up to speed so much quicker because the enforcement is there. I'm literally training them while they're getting code reviews. I'm training them while they're using their IDE. This thing is happening live. And so I don't have to wait until the code review is done and have a human come over and walk and explain to them, these things. You still want to help lift your people up, but anything I can do with automation is really, really helpful. All right, so that's all I had. I talked a lot. Got fewer questions than I would like, but that's okay. So how about complaints? Do people have complaints? Did this strike anybody as looking odd? Not great? I always like to ask.
I guess, John, from your point of view, I assume that the investment at the moment is to writing rules, right? Like a rule pack or rule files to actually using the tool, or is it? I am thinking in terms of the maturity of the tools. If at the moment, right now, it has few days, if you are gonna embrace this, let's say, you are gonna spend time like writing those rules, right? Because the tool itself is mature.
Yeah, I think if I were starting with semgrep, what I would do if I was a security team member, I would pull semgrep. I would run a scan with the open source rule set, and there's lots of them. If you go to the main page of semgrep, actually, I'll try to do that now. Semgrep dev, this is their, oh, they changed it. Oh, this is not the thing. Hang on. Playground, maybe. Nope. Rules, maybe. Yeah, here we go. Sorry. So enforce secure guardrails, right? So if I've got, okay, here we go. Secrets, detecting secrets checked into version control. Or if I want to just check for XSS or just check for insecure transport, you can do this pretty quickly. There's also a like an all R2C all. There's an R2C CI. So they have the rules broken down into different things. You can do it by language. You can do it, whatever it is. You can check if you've got a Flask application, you can scan with that, so forth. So there's lots of things that you can check. And I would play with a couple rule sets, just get used to what it looks like, what the findings look like. And then I would find 1 or 2 or 3 things in your organization that you want to enforce, or that like read your code review guidelines, see if you can pick one and enforce it, right? The argument for shrinking down what you support is, and one thing that was really hard for us, because we do have a lot of things that we support, is we had to have a separate, like, if you already have hooks where you can add a tool to CI and it just runs on everything, you win. You're ahead of the game, right? Congratulations, right? If you have programmatic CI and you can add something to some parent config file, and so all your projects get scanned with this new thing, then you win. You're in good shape. But if you've got to scan lots of applications and they're sitting in lots of different places or whatever, then you have a little bit more work to do, and you've got to get kind of that centralized scanning piece set up. You got to figure out what that looks like. It could look like forcing everybody to consolidate, which, depending on how much capital you have, that may or may not work. But you got to have some mechanism for scanning everything. But add one rule, test it on one project, test it on 2 projects, 3 projects. If you're happy with it, roll it out everywhere in a non-blocking mode. And then what you have is, across your fleet, you can add a rule and see it everywhere, right? I didn't get approval, so I can't share our internal dashboard. But what the thing I can do is say, okay, for this rule, across my fleet, how many instances of this rule are? Now let me drill down on that rule and see all the applications that are affected by it. To me, that's a crazy powerful primitive. It's not built into any CI that I have. We had to build an external system, so there's a lot to do there, but really useful. So depending on your environment, you may or may have a little more work to do there.
I have a quick question.
Oh, hey. No heckling. No heckling. Hey, what's up, man?
Do you use the same rule set across all of your repos, or do you have a way to make them context aware outside of the environment stuff?
Yes and yes. Let me go back. There is a slide where I tried to kind of sort of talk through that, but yeah, well, I'll just pick this one. Can I pick a particular application? That would go under scope. So the point I was making earlier, there's this metadata block, right? And this metadata block is whatever you want it to be. But the important thing is, with semgrep, when you write a rule, this metadata block gets transferred, lifted from your rule into the output. So if there's a finding for unsafe MD5, that finding is going to have all of this data verbatim in it. Now it'll be in JSON format instead of YAML, but it'll literally get transposed over. So when we parse the rules on the other side, right, there's 2 things. One, when we parse the rules on the other side, let's say I found this in an IDE, right? This finding in an IDE, I can say you should go to this link, and I can put that little squiggly under there. Or if I found it and cut a ticket because of it, I can put that hyperlink in the JIRA ticket. So that's after the fact of how I can parse the metadata and use it for helpful things. Beforehand, when we call, like our IDE plugin is not smart enough to do this, but it wouldn't take much, right? We could modify it or customize it. If you had a scope, tools here, we have this tools thing. The IDE plugin could be smart enough to pre-process the rules, and our other tools do this. Our IDE does not. But for instance, our code review, we have a code review bot, and that code review bot has a check before it runs the semgrep rules. It says, is this tools field, does it have semgrep? Does it have code review bot, or does it have all? If not, don't run this rule.
Right.
Don't load this rule in. If it does, run this rule. So you could pick the tools that run it, and then for scope, the same thing. Scope is global for everything, which I'm just realizing it should be all, so we should be consistent. But you can put, this is actually a comma separated list of application names. So if you had an application name, you could scan it against whatever. So yeah, we do support that. And we do have specific rules, like on some of our monoliths. We have we have a handful of monoliths and a lot of smaller applications in the thousands. And so on the monoliths, we do run certain rules because they're specific to the monolith, but we don't want to run all those rules on everything else. And so we'll scope those down to one or more of those applications.
And then just like curious for your opinionated stance on it, the scope, is it like by repo or is it like application? So like multiple repos might be a type of application.
Yeah. So hard problem. We chose we chose VCS repo. That was our starting point. However, there's another guy that I've been talking to a lot, and they've got a mono repo. Screw that, like a hard problem, right? You can't do it when it's a mono repo. So you gotta have some kind of an abstraction layer that works for you. And we were talking earlier about the difficulty of threading all these things. So you've got VCS, CI, your deployment tool, right? Like the thing it's called in Kubernetes and the thing it's called in CI and the thing it's called in VCS may be 3 different things. You've got to have a way to thread those needles. And then, holy cow, what if your application is, 3 lambdas that each have a VCS repo, and then 1 microservice or 5 microservices that each have a VCS repo, but it's also, 2 external vendor APIs that you're hitting, right? Those are considered in scope. Like, how do you tie all those things together? That's, for me, an unsolved problem. It's hard to, granularity is starting to become a problem, right? It's actually gotten harder because of distributed software.
Just to reiterate, you're doing post-processing with things like tools, but you're doing pre-processing with the scope?
Well, pre-processing with tools and pre-processing with scope, and post-processing with confidence, status, and references. So if confidence and severity, obviously, confidence and severity help us dial the knob on, is it red, is it yellow, is it green? Do we show it, do we not? How high is it in the list? Status is like, is it dev, test, prod? So an example would be we're only going to cut tickets for production rules, because a dev or test rule, we don't have enough, we may have high confidence in that rule, but it's not done with its test flow yet. We have an internal flow that says you write a rule, you get the results, you dashboard all the findings, you make sure there's no false positives, then you promote it to test, and then you do the same thing, but now these things get a little more scrutiny from more people. Now they get promoted to prod, and then you're actually cutting tickets. You can imagine the same thing with code review, with our code review bot technology. You may or may not make a comment. Like if something is in, is it in dev mode? No comments. Test mode, this is a rule we think is going to work, but puts a little warning. This rule may not be super, let us know if this rule sucks, kind of thing. And then production is, we're actually making comments on, that line of the code review because we're confident that we found something real. And then references are just like, when you're cutting tickets or making comments on code reviews in the IDE, we want to share those so people can have the references that we put in place. This lets you do things like document what your policies, and even like if you can, you could think of coupling these things. So if you wrote 2 rules and you scoped 1 rule to a specific monolith that had a way of doing things, and then you had a duplicate rule that was scoped to everything else, right? So we probably should add support in here for like the not specific application. That probably makes sense. But you can imagine having a set of guidance for this monolith because it does things in a specific way, and everything else should kind of get generic guidance. Right. So we can start to have, more discrete things for things that are large, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one last question before I let you go. How many rules are you running in your rule set right now, and how long does that take?
You definitely see an impact as you scale up rules. So we run our internal set of rules is probably in the, I guess 50, 70, somewhere in there right now. But we also run literally the kitchen sink of R2C. So like we throw everything at it because we want to identify, like, are we seeing a lot of a specific thing that helps us, right? And we have the hardware to run it, right? We just spin up new instances and go. I would say there was a change that R2C made in the code, and it took our largest application from like 12 minutes to 28. And so that was substantive, right, for us. Most of our applications are sub a minute or two, so not much. And that's running all the rules. Yeah, so I mean, it's not
a full scan of the repo versus like just
yeah.
scan. Yeah, okay.
Yep, that's full scans. And that's, yeah, like when we're doing code review, we do our code review bot, which we stole the idea from somebody else. Thank you, those people at PayPal, for that, their AppSec talk. When we do code reviews, we get the before, the after. Like if you got 10 files diff, we get the before, the after, and then the patch, right? The actual diff file. And then we have certain analyzers that run on whatever, different pieces of it. So we do run semgrep in there, but we run other tools that are diff aware. And so for semgrep, like we've never had, and we have some big code reviews. We've never had it take more than a minute, I think, on any code review anywhere. And that's running like everything we could throw at it. So it's not nothing. It's not grep fast, but it's also not incredibly impactful. Yeah. Like if you do a, it's going to be however long it takes to do a build plus some, right? It's in the low multiples of doing a build. It's not your classic static analysis, like hours or days thing.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Great talk.
Thanks. Other thoughts? Of course I went over. Oh, no, I didn't go over. Did I go over? I went over. No, I didn't. I don't know.
We don't mind.
Yes, I did. Okay. I did go over. I was trying to look at my calendar to see what I did. Okay. Other questions? I don't want to leave anybody hanging.
Thank you, David, for your questions. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And John,
yep,
please join us in our Slack, and people can continue asking you questions there. That's
okay. I don't know that I have it. Have a link to it handy, but if you'll send it to in the chat, I will join.
Yeah, I also DM'd you on Twitter.
Oh, there it is.
The link
okay,
well, so
got it.
worry.
I will join momentarily then.
Thank you so much. It was really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day or evening or night, everybody, wherever you are.
Great. Thank y'all so much for letting me chat. And if anybody wants to reach out via Slack or anything later, I genuinely love talking about this stuff. And I am more than happy to get better ideas from other people.
Thanks so much.